So, but this talk is pretty cool. It's I gave this talk in 2009, and it was actually a few months before Tomer and I started doing Quixey. So kind of an interesting time in our lives. And then I kind of put it on the shelf, and I thought I'd bust it out now because it's actually still really interesting. And the author of a lot of material that I drew to get this talk, Eliezer Yudkowsky, he's actually come and spoken at Quixey a couple times, like in 2013, around that period. And we should actually bring him back. That'd be really cool because he's a really good speaker. All right, so you are a brain. What do I mean by that? Let's dive right into it. Okay, imagine you have an assignment to draw a map. You're a map maker, okay? And you live in Scottsdale. All right, so in order to do this assignment of making a map, here's what you do. You go into your house and sit on your favorite recliner and close the blinds and start drawing the map. Okay, is that a good map-making approach? No, right? It's an obviously flawed map-making approach. Okay, but let's actually be super analytic about it. What is the actual reason why that's an obviously bad approach? Like, what's that? Lack of information? Okay, sure, that's right. Okay, and I bet I can make it even more precise. So check this out, okay? Here's your city, and then map X is what I call the map that you end up drawing. Okay, so I can be a little bit more precise than saying lack of information. More precisely, the map X that you end up with is actually independent of whether you actually live in your city or whether you live in a different city. So it's actually the causal relationship between the city you live in and the map you end up with, which is the problem here. So yeah, you need a causal connection between the territory and the map. You need to basically let the city take your hand and move your pen. Because if you use any other process that's not like letting the city, move your pen for you, then you're not going to end up with the right map. So that's like a big analogy to how your brain forms accurate beliefs. Sorry, one sec. Let me just silence the alarm that's about to go off. Okay. Now, this is you. Like literally, this is you. You are a brain. Okay? And this is where you live. You live in a really dark skull where you can't, see anything or anything like that. All right. Now, when you understand things, what does it mean to understand something? It means that inside of your brain, inside of the structure of your brain, is physically a map. So like your neurons, reconfigure themselves just like you would reconfigure ink on a piece of paper to draw a map. We're talking about a physical process here that we talk about when we talk about the word understanding. All right, so understanding actually means having an accurate map of the territory physically inside yourself. That's what understanding means. All right, so the analogy is that if you want to have accurate beliefs, you need to let reality causally drive your beliefs. That's the only process that will write you accurate beliefs in your head. Yeah, do you have a question?
So you said understanding means a good map of territory inside you. What do you mean by territory inside you? What is
So what I mean is it's a good map of the territory, and that map is inside you.
That's if you are understanding a territory space, if you're understanding an accurate map.
Right, like imagine I go to you and I say like, hey,
That's all understanding. That's understanding in this space.
That's right. So when I say I understand X, it means I have a map of X inside my head. Yeah, so if I come to you and I say, hey, I have a good understanding of machine learning, okay, what do I actually mean by that? I mean that if you were to scan the neurons of my brain, you would see structures that model the shape of the machine learning information domain, like physically encoded in the structure of my neurons. That's what it means to have understanding. Right? Like normally we wave our hands and we act like it's, we're all just like abstract beings, but we're actually all brains. So it's interesting to think about the fact that we're actually like talking about the structure of our neurons in a sense when we talk about understanding things. All right. Here's a map making exercise. Okay? How many fingers am I holding up? Okay, so you guys just understood a piece of the territory in front of you, right? But what just happened? Well, the sun, or in this case, these cool lights, basically sent some photons at my hand, and then they bounced off, and then they went into, your eye, which is a whole complicated machine whose goal is to take a bunch of, electromagnetic fluctuations as input, and then output like a bunch of highly abstract, processed, visual, 3D encodings or whatever, and then you've got like a whole counting system as well. So then you could like count the abstract fingers. Okay, so all that stuff happened. but I just want to show you the causal flow, like follow the arrows, right? It is a flow of causality, like the great web of causality that connects the hands and, my hand in our universe to the map in your brain. Like we're talking about a physical process here that just happened when you yelled out 5. All right. Now, why aren't mental maps perfect, right? Like now that we've talked about what understanding means, it's interesting to dive into why understanding doesn't end up perfect. Okay, so I've cataloged 3 reasons. Reason number 1, you can't see the whole territory, right? That's an obvious one. Like it's no surprise if a bird just flew overhead that wasn't in your map. No surprise why, right? We got this opaque roof here. Okay. You're computationally bounded. So even if I actually, even if I gave you access to like a giant hard drive with like the entire state of the universe on it, like per second, you just can't make every conclusion from it because you're computationally bounded. Okay. And also the third one is actually the most interesting. You're biased. Because biases aren't like a fundamental limitation in the universe. They're actually just kind of a kind of perverse architecture flaw in the human brain. So I'm going to go into detail about biases. But first, actually, I'm going to talk about being computationally bounded real quick. All right. So the computer scientists, the software engineers here probably have heard the term heuristic. Okay, what is a heuristic? An easy procedure for using sensory input to draw a mental map. So that's what a heuristic is in the context of your brain understanding stuff. Okay. Pro, it's computationally feasible. Con, it's not always accurate. Okay, but your brain basically relies on heuristics because it can't just perfectly understand everything. It's computationally bounded. All right, so here's a heuristic that your brain does. It's called colors. It's called color vision, right? The whole notion of color vision is actually just evolution taking a pretty ridiculous shortcut to try to understand the electromagnetic spectrum. If you really wanted to get an accurate understanding of the electromagnetic radiation in front of you, what you would show is basically all these different wavelengths, right? Like you would decompose the electromagnetic radiation hitting your eye, you decompose it into different wavelengths. And the wavelengths would just be a continuous spectrum from miles long wavelengths to nanometer long wavelengths, just this continuous spectrum of possible wavelengths. Okay? But wait a minute, you don't really see that. You see colors. Okay? So the whole notion of colors doesn't exist in the universe at all. Basically, whoever wrote the algorithm in your head, okay, evolution, was like, hey, I'm just going to make up these buckets called like red, yellow, green, turquoise. I'm just going to invent some arbitrary buckets. Oh, and like there's no buckets for like anything less than, 400 nanometers or greater than like 800 nanometers. They're only for this little part of the spectrum. Like, see, the rest of the spectrum is like completely ignored. Just ignore that part, okay? And I'm just going to make up these color names. So that's like how you, that's your heuristic for seeing the world around you. But in practice, it's pretty cool. Like, for example, every time your red sensor goes off, there actually is a good correlation between that and like you should get alert because like danger's nearby, right? Like maybe it's a stop sign, right? Or like in the ancestral environment, maybe it's like a dangerous beetle or something, right? Or like somebody bleeding. So it turns out that heuristic like actually, is probably naturally selected for. It's like a good heuristic. But my point here is that you're not really perceiving reality, right? It's like you got this piece of code written in your head that's how it understands reality, but if you think about it, it's pretty ridiculous. It's pretty disconnected from the actual reality. Okay, so check this out. Oh yeah, like just diving into this, it's actually very interesting how your brain goes about mapping the reality of electromagnetic wavelengths to the colors that you consciously perceive. There's really a lot going on. So have you guys heard of your, your light cones, right? Like your eye has rods and cones. Okay, let's talk about your cones. So you might have heard that you have like the red cone and the green cone and the blue cone. And like if you're red-green colorblind, it means like, I don't know, either your red or your green cone's messed up, I guess. Okay, so first of all, the cones don't really have colors. Okay, so actually it's highly misleading that these cone lines are drawn with colors. I probably should have made the image monochrome. I'm not happy that the Google Images site I stole this from used colors. I think it's highly misleading. Like the one that's called like the green cone, for example, okay, that green line in the middle, all it's saying is that the function that maps wavelength to neural response looks like that. Okay, what do I mean? So you have these cone cells, okay, and their input is electromagnetic waves, and their output is like amount of firing, okay? So see that like bell-shaped green curve? What it's saying is that if I give it like a 550 nanometer electromagnetic wave, then it'll like fire the most that it can possibly fire into your brain, okay? But then if I give it like a 600 millimeter wavelength of light, then it'll like not fire that much. Okay, so that's what that means. The fact that like the guy who made this graph drew it as a green line, it's a little ridiculous because like, look, I could literally fire, I could show it an orange, a 620 nanometer light wave, and then it'll like still fire a bit, even though it's your green cone. Okay, it's kind of interesting. Anyway, so that's what your cones do. And then your brain basically has some software to analyze the firing of all three cones together and then come to a conclusion, file it into a color bucket. All right, so like this is kind of why computer monitors work. Like, have you ever, made your screen yellow on your computer? Like if you're watching an episode of The Simpsons, right? Your computer's yellow, right? Okay, but it doesn't actually have any yellow pixels. It has red, green, and blue pixels. So your computer is basically playing you for a fool. It just shines a tiny red dot next to a tiny green dot, and then your cones are so stupid that the red and green cones fire together, and that actually adds up to the same neural response that you get as if there was an actual yellow light shining at you. So what I mean is, if your computer shines a combination of a 550 millimeter wavelength and and like a 600 millimeter wavelength at your eye simultaneously, you actually cannot perceive the difference between that and if your computer were to shine like a 580 millimeter wavelength. So you're basically merging together two totally distinct electromagnetic phenomena in your color perception. So there's like miles and miles of studies about like all the ridiculous shortcuts that you're taking when you have color perception. So this is kind of my point, that like you're not really perceiving reality. All right, any questions? Yeah.
So this is very interesting. One thing that comes to my mind is one important factor is labeling. By that, I mean, when a child is growing up, the parent's job is to keep labeling things for her. Like they show her different things and say, oh, this is red, this is red, this is red.
Yeah.
I feel that what's happening in the child's brain is, whatever experience that I'm having right now, this is red.
Okay.
It's not even, maybe he doesn't even know what that experience is, but
Yep.
the current state is red. I would be very interested to see, like, if we have a child that grows up with no labeling,
Uh-huh.
what happens to her?
Okay, so the question is like, hey, aren't a lot of these perceptions caused by developmental labeling? I'm just going to say developmental labeling is, more minor than like the fundamental cone responses, and I'm going to consider it like a smaller phenomenon that's outside of the scope of this talk. So that's my response to that. Okay. So that's the illusion of color, or the heuristic of color. All right, here's another interesting thing that our color vision is missing, okay? So you look at this yellow flower. This is an actual flower, all right? And it's like, yeah, I'm perceiving this flower pretty well. It's definitely yellow. I'm glad that the electromagnetic waves bouncing off this flower happen to be around 600 nanometers so that it could fall into one of my buckets as opposed to looking black, right? Fortunate coincidence that I'm able to perceive everything. Nope, you can't, because actually this is what it looks like if you were an insect. Like, turns out that it has a bunch of like ultraviolet electromagnetic radiation bouncing off it too. And as a human, you just have no idea. To you, it looks equivalent as if it didn't have that going on. Okay, but if you were an insect, this is actually an evolutionary adaptation that the flower has, that it's basically signaling to insects. It kind of looks like a bullseye, that they should like come pollinate it or something. So like, this is my whole point. There's like important stuff going on in reality that your map is like not even drawing into your map. Okay, so we just go around, like our understanding is just our best effort using our heuristics to like, model what's going on in reality. But there's a huge disconnect. We can't help it. There's limitations. All right. Illusions reveal your heuristics. So I basically already told you guys about an illusion, like the fact that your pixels show you red and green and then you think it's a yellow color. Like that's literally how The Simpsons works on your computer, is a red and green pixel close to each other. So that's like an illusion. All right. And anytime that you notice yourself getting tricked by an illusion, it's a reflection on what heuristics you're using to perceive stuff. Okay, why aren't mental maps perfect? Okay, so the third reason is you're biased. Let me just say one more thing about illusions. Okay, the actual way that people study how your perception works is basically by studying how illusions fool you. Like they work backwards they're reverse engineering how your heuristics must work by watching your ridiculous responses to illusions. All right, so you're biased. Let's talk about biases. Okay, definition of a bias: a deviation from a good map drawing procedure. That's my working definition of a bias. So if you look at the other two reasons why the other two reasons why your mental map's not perfect, these are like fundamental limitations, right? You can't see the whole territory. Even if you built like a super intelligent AI, the super intelligent AI probably wouldn't be able to see the whole territory. Even the super intelligent AI would be computationally bounded. Okay, but this third one is just a random quirk of, you know, our humanness, which is that we are just built in with algorithms that accomplish other purposes besides giving us accurate beliefs, and sometimes they like actively undermine our accurate beliefs, and they're called biases. So here's some example biases. Okay, one is called stereotyping. So that would be you draw a map that is skewed toward what you expect it to see. Like a super intelligent AI would never do that. That's obviously a wrong way to draw a map, but as a human, you probably will do that. Okay, defensiveness. You don't fix a mistake in your map because you don't want to admit being wrong. Okay, so super intelligent AI, I wouldn't program an ego into it, so it would have no trouble just fixing its map anytime it notices a correction. All right, wishful thinking. You draw whatever makes you feel good on your map. So you have this region of your map, you're not convinced what's in there, so instead of like really exploring and making sure you're getting it right, you just casually draw in what you wish was there. Let me show you an example of wishful thinking. Okay? Hey, I haven't really fully explored what's in this region of space. It looks, I just kind of hope that it's really cute and furry. Well, I'm just gonna go pet it. I'm not gonna fix my map that much. Bam, porcupine! So you don't want to, you know, wishful thinking can really screw you. Got to be careful. All right. So let's review. You don't have direct access to reality. But the thing is that you feel like your map of reality is reality, right? Like you don't stop to think like, oh yeah, my color vision is just a random heuristic. I have no idea what's really going on in the electromagnetic spectrum in front of my face right now. You don't stop to think that, even though it's like totally true. Right? I mean, hey, do you ever stop to think how like every possible radio broadcast and TV broadcast and Wi-Fi signal and cell phone conversation ever is like in the air right in front of your head right now, like you know, in the local area? That's like a ton of signals that you're like completely ignoring. Yeah. All right. But you feel like your map of reality is reality, and that's what it feels like to be a brain. Right? You are a brain. That's the main point here. Okay. Here's like another type of illusion. Okay. Have you guys heard of miracle fruit? Anybody? Okay, miracle fruit is actually pretty cool. I suggest you order it. You know, you just go online, search for miracle fruit tablets or whatever. It's basically this fruit that has this enzyme. You put it on your tongue, and it actually like binds these proteins to your like tongue proteins on your taste buds. And basically, if you were to suck on a lemon after eating this miracle fruit, normally the lemon goes and stimulates your sour taste buds, but after this kind of binds to your proteins, makes them shape differently, then suddenly that lemon citric acid is now binding to your sweet taste buds. So now your sweet taste buds are firing. So the lemon actually tastes sweet. You can just suck on the lemon and be like, this is, you know, delicious. So the whole point was like, the lemon, think about this, okay? The lemon was never sour to begin with. Did I just blow your mind? Yeah, it was never, you know, it could be, if you were born with like proteins with that shape, the lemon would have just been sweet your whole life, and you wouldn't be wrong to think that, right? It's just your perception. Okay. Anyway, next point is a superstimulus. Okay, a stimulus that misleads your desire heuristics. So like the reason why you have, you know, certain desires and drives is basically, you know, natural selection, to some extent genetic drift, mostly natural selection. So like, you know, you guys probably know this, right? Like fat and sugar taste great because any ounce of fat and sugar you could get like 1,000,000 years ago was awesome. Like you really should be gorging yourself on fat and sugar if you live 1,000,000 years ago, and the most you could ever find fat and sugar is like once a month or whatever, on a good day, right? So it's totally rational, it's right and proper to be gorging yourself on as much fat and sugar as you can get if you live 1,000,000 years ago. Right? And sure enough, natural selection like wrote that piece of code saying gorge on fat and sugar, and it's still there, right? It's like legacy code running in your head right now. Gorge yourself on fat and sugar. Okay. There's other superstimuli. I mean, right, a piece of chocolate cake, again, if you live 1,000,000 years ago, you're totally doing it right. If a chocolate cake drops from the sky and you eat it, everything's cool. But it's not cool today. All right. Okay, next thing about being a brain. Unconscious map computation. This means you compute a property and you add it to your map, but your consciousness only sees the finished map. So it's like your unconscious mind basically stealth computed something, and then like when you open your eyes, it's just like, oh yeah, this thing just exists. Because remember, you just only see your map. You think that your map is reality. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, here's a comic that somebody made about you know, a girl in a torn dress being carted off by this alien. Okay, so the artist who is drawing the comic in his mind, it was probably like, yeah, of course the alien wants to, go make off with this girl, because inside the alien's brain, human female, that's he's going to compute the property sexy, right? Okay, but maybe that's actually not what goes on inside the alien's brain, because not all brains actually have to work the same, right? Especially like across species and life forms and stuff, okay? Maybe actually what the alien is computing is tasty. You never know. Like to the alien, it might actually, the girl might actually look tasty, like mouth-wateringly tasty, okay? So, yeah, I mean, the whole point is you'll just open your eyes, okay? And if you're like some of us, you'll just open your eyes and you'll feel a sense of attraction to this kind of stimulus, and you just assume that the stimulus itself has an inherent essence of attractiveness, but it really doesn't at all, right? Like I could go tweak your code and suddenly you'd be like repulsed instead of attracted, or suddenly you'd want to go eat it instead of, attracted. All right, that brings me to wrong question. This is another thing that brains have. A question about your map that wouldn't make sense if you had a more accurate map. It's a very, very interesting thing to think about. Here's an example. Okay, let's say you're an alien. You have no idea what life forms on Earth are like, and then you're an alien like from literally from an alternate dimension. And then I show you this diagram of the human digestive system. It's like, yeah, there's the stomach, small intestine, colon, rectum. Okay, that's the diagram. So if you're an alien, you might be studying this diagram, and you could be like, okay, wait a minute. I see a problem here. How does this even work? Because that big tube over there, that seems to split the organism in half. See what I mean? Like imagine you're from a two-dimensional universe. So you're like, this is clearly impossible. Okay? So how would you answer that alien? You can't just be like, oh, actually, no, there's like some tape you can't see. No, that's not the answer, right? The answer is that the alien's mental model of what's going on here is so wrong that when the alien is asking a question about its mental model, the only way to answer the question is to be like, hold on a second, let me take a step back and fix the wrong mental model you drew in the first place, and then you'll ask a more intelligent question, and then we can move forward. Okay. So it's funny to laugh at the alien for doing that, except we all do it all the time. Like we all ask wrong questions all the time because we don't realize that our mental models are flawed. So for example, like when I learned that insects can see, ultraviolet and stuff, like in the last example with the flower, I asked myself, like, what do the infrared and ultraviolet colors look like? Right? It's like I kind of wish that I could see more than like a tiny part of the electromagnetic spectrum, because I bet there would be some really interesting new colors, right? But then I realized, like, it's actually the structure of your brain that invents the whole perception of colors and stuff like that. So, I could just, maybe ultraviolet, I could just tweak my code so that ultraviolet is just like green or whatever. Like, to the extent that these ultraviolet colors have a perception, it's just because my brain would be architected to feel that certain perception. There's really nothing about the phenomenon itself that carries the conscious perception with it. That's pretty deep, but like some examples of that is like I was just listening to a podcast talking about how like this guy who went blind but then uses clicks to do like echolocation so he can still like navigate really well. Okay, that guy, to him, he says that his conscious experience is like he basically sees the same kind of world that you see out of the corner of your eye. So even though no light is entering his rod and cone cells, the subjective perception of his world is basically equivalent to the world that you see out of the corner of your eye. Like, it really just feels like you're in a three-dimensional world and you see objects even though they're kind of blurry. That's his subjective perception. So that doesn't mean, oh, that's what sounds are like. No, right? Because like clicks are still like clicks. Like my point is that it's a wrong question to ask about the subjective experience of a phenomenon in the world, because subjective experience is entirely generated by your brain. All right, here's another thing. This whole concept of mysterious. Okay, take a moment to reflect on what the word mysterious means. Like, can somebody give me an example of like something which seems mysterious? Or what does it mean for something to be mysterious? Okay, poorly understood. That's good. Any other thoughts? Like, now that you know the distinction between, map and territory, like, where does that leave this feeling of mysteriousness? I can tell you the ancients would look up at the heavens and be like, well, we kind of have some science explaining what's going down here on Earth, but in the sky, it's basically just like, a crazy wallpaper where it's like, infinitely beyond the realm of human understanding.
Lack of a mental map.
Sure. Lack of a mental map. Exactly. Okay. here's here's what mysteriousness is like. Imagine you're a time traveler from 1,000,000 years ago, and you come into the present, and you see a car like driving around, doing its thing, and you're like, I have no idea what's going on here. In fact, I'm guessing it's like some sort of demon, right? That'd be a natural response. So in your mind, sure, you model it as some object, but you just kind of take your confusion and you just draw a black box around it, and you're like, whatever. This thing is inherently mysterious. There is no way anybody could understand a car or like an iPhone. Like, it wouldn't even occur to them that this object is something that they could deconstruct, right? Like, a human's natural reaction to something they're confused about is to kind of back off and be like, whoa, that is an inherently confusing thing. I will stay away from the confusing thing. Or maybe I will like make a ritualistic chant about the confusing thing, right? But it doesn't really occur to people in many cases to just start deconstructing the confusing thing in the style of science. I mean, the scientific method was only invented 400 years ago, right? In the 2,000,000-year history of the human species, the idea of let's go observe stuff and have it draw our mental maps was invented 400 years ago. That's pretty pathetic, guys. Let's try to do better. All right. So this stuff is still considered mysterious, right? I mean, I personally, feel like it's mysterious. Consciousness, I don't fully understand my own consciousness, and I don't even know like how my understanding of my own consciousness is going to develop. It seems like it's kind of on the cutting edge of what we understand and don't understand. Existence, like physical versus mathematical existence, I'm actually not sure how things can make the jump from being mathematically logically coherent to physically existing. It's kind of an interesting problem, some mystery surrounding it. Parallel universes, I'm not sure which types of parallel universes really exist and which types only theoretically exist. I'm actually pretty confident that at least 1 or 2 types of parallel universes exist. I'd be like extremely surprised if no parallel universes existed. But anyway, I'm a little confused about the matter, okay? But here's my point. Okay? Look at all these things that aren't mysterious anymore. The heavens, right? Like when Newton realized that the same force, the apple story is apocryphal, but still, when Newton realized that the same force that was making the apple fall to Earth was also the same force that was keeping the moon in orbit around the Earth, and the Earth in orbit around the sun, suddenly it was like, wait, this isn't just this crazy wallpaper. Like, this space up here is actually, like a clockwork universe. Like, there are actually, laws and mechanics explaining the heavens, not just explaining this magisterium here on Earth. So basically, anytime you look at a place you're confused about, and you have the reaction of like putting a black box around it, again and again, history surprises us and shows that you can actually take it apart and like see the little moving gears. And it never had any inherent mystery to it, right? So like the fact that if you think that stuff falling down to Earth is not that mysterious, then the moon going around the Earth is not that mysterious either, because it's a logical implication of the same reason that stuff falls to Earth, that the moon should go around the Earth. So suddenly mystery just dissolves completely. And the crazy thing is that the track record is like pretty close to 100% of like when you try attacking a mystery long enough, it just seems to dissolve into not being a mystery again and again. But regardless of that track record, I want to make a point here that the territory is 100% mysteriousness free. The territory is just the territory. It's just doing its thing, right? Like from the territory's perspective, everything is completely non-mysterious. Like the universe is just the way it is. Okay? Maybe you as a human find it mysterious, right? But I could just change your code base to have a non-mysterious reaction to it, right? So one day it's like, oh, quantum theory is so mysterious, how can a particle be in 2 places at once? Okay, and then I tweak your code base, and the next day you're saying like, yep, particles are in multiple places at once. Makes perfect sense. You know what I'm saying? Like the universe is just chilling. That's my philosophical insight for you this afternoon, is that the universe is just chilling. Okay, and this whole notion of mysteriousness is entirely in your map. Okay, so when your map contains mysteriousness, sometimes you find a non-mysterious answer to your mysterious question, sometimes you learn more about the territory, and then that tells you that your question was actually a wrong question. Like, these are pretty much the only 2 outcomes that ever happen whenever you see something as mysterious. All right. There's a cool quote from Eliezer Yudkowsky, the author of the Rationality from AI to Zombies and one of the biggest authors of LessWrong.com, also the author of the world's most popular Harry Potter fanfiction book. The quote is, ignorance exists in the map, not in the territory. If I am ignorant about a phenomenon, that is a fact about my own state of mind, not a fact about the phenomenon itself. Pretty profound. Okay. So here are basically the takeaways. since you're a brain. Number one, your map drawing processes can be disconnected from the territory, right? So what's going on in your head when you just feel like you understand reality? You're basically, you've got this construction. And by the way, you're right a lot of the time, right? Like, I'm pretty sure I'm right that this ground is going to keep supporting me. Like, I'm pretty sure my mental model is accurate here about this chair on this ground, right? Like 99.99% sure. That's pretty good. So like, a lot of your mental model is actually correct, but it still only captures like a tiny piece of the universe, and it still like fails to predict lots of important stuff, and sometimes it like actively wrongly predicts stuff. Okay. But the thing is, you feel like your map is the territory. So you're not like standing back and being objective about what you understand and don't understand. Like, it just looks like that flower is yellow and doesn't have any sort of bullseye painted on it. Like, you feel sure of it. Like, an ancient human would have like, staked his life on it, on the fact that he accurately perceives the yellowness of the flower, right? Like, it really feels like you're just observing reality. Okay. And then finally, there are no mysterious answers. Right? It's the question that contains the essence of the mystery, but if you were to know the answer, you would realize that the answer was not mysterious to begin with. So now your map actually includes your map. So when you go around thinking about, phenomena in the world, you won't just model the phenomenon existing, you'll model how the phenomenon causally draws your map inside your head, and like part of your map will like include a drawing of your map itself. And then that will have a map in it, and so on. So you can be a more effective brain. Like, this knowledge is actually practical applied knowledge, right? Like reflecting on what a belief is, what understanding is, like it can actually be pretty useful. I mean, I remember one time in college, I was trying to understand like this really hard math thing, like this really hard math concept from like this advanced math class I was taking, and one reason I kept getting thrown off is I was kind of confused about how my own thinking worked. I'm like, what am I even doing right now? Like, closing my eyes really hard and trying to like think about this math. How is this even working? So I actually found it pretty useful to know that like that understanding is the physical process of writing a map inside my neurons that is like isomorphic to the reality structure around me. I actually found that thought kind of put an end to some of my confusion and let me concentrate more on the math. Personally, so I'm sure you guys all feel the same way. All right. There's some further reading. So there's a really cool book called Rationality from AI to Zombies. Check that out. And there's also lesswrong.com. It's like a group blog about rationality, but it has a cool part called The Sequences, written by Eliezer Yudkowsky, and I highly recommend checking those out. And you'll find a lot of the same content in Eliezer Yudkowsky's Sequences on lesswrong.com. You'll find a lot of the same content there that you will in Rationality from AI to Zombies, but you don't have to pay $5. So it's rational to do that. Yeah, Manoj.
You also recommend the book Flatland?
Sure, yeah, Flatland. Sure, yeah. So I read Flatland once. It's a good book that helps you imagine the abstract concept of dimensions of space. That's right. Yeah. If you want to know, if you want to explore more about what a two-dimensional alien would think, you should definitely read Flatland. Yeah. 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 By the way, sorry, if you're asking a question, try to talk really loud.
Yes. So those guys, especially Kahneman, is very, very pessimistic about people actually being able to change, like to change their bias, like biased behavior, right?
Yep.
And now, obviously, that's not black and white, right? There's some areas where it's worth trying to. I think it's worth trying to work on changing your biases.
Yep.
But then some areas are harder than others. Do you see, like, do you have any perspective on that, or
Yep.
like areas of kind of low-hanging fruit things that people should work on as far as that goes?
Yep. Okay. So the question is, there's been a bunch of research into the idea of biases, and you see a lot of authors who come from the perspective of, hey, we have all these biases, we're fundamentally flawed, and the end. Like, good luck out there, biased creature. Okay. So do I kind of agree with that sentiment? Okay. I don't, and actually this book, Rationality from AI to Zombies, is actually remarkable. It distinguishes itself from a lot of Kahneman's work, distinguishes itself from books, from Dan Ariely's work, like Predictably Irrational. There's a lot of books that just kind of poke fun at us and leave it at that, whereas this book gives you like actual strategies for if you wanted to become, a better thinker yourself, if you wanted to draw your own mental map more accurately, Or maybe if you just want to go build a super intelligent AI and have that have accurate beliefs, whatever floats your boat, that book will help you do that. Any more questions? I think, I'll tell you also how this rationality stuff influences me. I feel like it's really opened up like my ability to have intelligent conversations whenever somebody has like a differing opinion from me. Suddenly I have this crazy, amazing superpower called changing my mind. Like, it really is an amazing superpower. If you actually count the number of times your mind was significantly changed to a belief that you felt pretty strongly about, let's say in the last month, like how many times have you really changed your mind? Maybe you think it's like a few, and then chances are it's even less than you think, actually, because there's studies that show that we change our minds less often than we think. It's actually really, really hard as a human to change your mind. If you remember, one of the biases was, defensiveness, as well as like, fake consistency, or like overly calibrated, over the top consistency. Like, you're like, well, I had this belief yesterday, right? Like, it's kind of like the way that they, in politics, you don't want to be a flip-flopper, right? So like, we all are afraid of, we're all afraid of being called a flip-flopper on some subconscious level, and other biases like that. And it's actually hard to change our minds. So I personally, kind of have a good tool set to change my mind. And here's how I do it. Every time we have a discussion, I imagine myself as just being, an AI. And the code of the AI maintains a variable of state, a state variable called the belief distribution. And it actually has a structure. A belief distribution is actually a mapping from possible hypotheses to belief probabilities in those hypotheses. So for example, I might think that there's a 30% chance that you really, my friend is a lot smarter than he thought, and he really did get like a perfect score on the SAT. And then there's like a 30% chance that he totally cheated. And then there's like a 40% chance that like the system has an error, right? If my friend comes to me with this high SAT score, I'll be like, what the hell? And I'll have a belief distribution over possible hypotheses. So when my friend tells me like, no way, man, I totally didn't cheat, I'd be like, okay, well, I have this pile of evidence that gives me an a priori beliefs that you cheated. So if you want to shift my belief, you should tell me like a piece of evidence that I don't already know. Like, let me show you my pile of evidence, and you should show me like, if you say a piece of evidence that's already in my pile of evidence, my correct response surely is to not update my belief probability in what you just said. So when I think of my beliefs as like when I think of myself not as like, I don't put my ego into it, I don't put my identity into it, I'm like, look, I'm just running an algorithm called artificial intelligence form accurate beliefs, right? It's called Bayesian reasoning. It's explained in this book. When I detach myself from how I form my beliefs and just run the algorithm of Bayesian reasoning and shift my belief probabilities using like well-established rules of probability theory, then suddenly it's like, I get to make statements like, I'll be talking to a guy and I'll be like, look, if you want to change my beliefs, like the following things will successfully update my beliefs in the following way. I can give the person basically a computational readout of what it would take to change my beliefs, as opposed to the way most people argue where they get all black and white about it and they're like, you know what, I just feel this, man. That's just how I feel. I don't think I'm going to change my mind. It's like, no, I'll always be able to change my mind. Like, if you want to convince me that the moon is actually an illusion projected by the government, like, forget going to the moon. If you want to convince me that the moon itself is not real, okay, you have an uphill battle, but what would it take? Well, first of all, if you could like find the guy who works the projector and tell him to turn it off, that's pretty convincing. Like right off the bat, I already update to like a 5% probability that maybe there's no moon. Right off the bat, if you want to get me up to 10%, there's plenty of other stuff you can do. You can like bring out a bunch of scientists who all like seem like they're in well-established positions, and they explain the conspiracy and explain how it was all like part of the Cold War. If a bunch of notable people say it, and if like 4chan and Reddit seem to agree that that's accurate, suddenly I'm up to like 30%, even 50% that there's no moon. Like, it's not that hard to convince me there's no moon. The biggest reason why it's hard to convince me that there's no moon is because there's a moon. That makes it really hard. That makes a lot of your life really hard. Like, a lot of your life becomes really hard to convince me there's no moon because the moon keeps throwing out all this inconvenient evidence that there's a moon. So you really have your work cut out for you to try to contradict that evidence. Okay, Sean. Yep. So, I mean, it's a tricky question. I mean, I think the most precise way I can answer your question is basically to set up a toy universe, like to basically build a universe from scratch, mathematically. To be like, hey, imagine a universe that's entirely like just a little game board, like Conway's Game of Life. It's just like a grid of squares, and every square has like a color, and then like basically make a bunch of formal rules. Or like, the universe could be like the game of chess. Right? Imagine my whole universe is a chess game. How do I form my beliefs that moving the piece one way will cause a certain outcome? Well, if I restrict the problem to be like this nice mathematical problem, then I can start giving you a nice mathematical answer. I could be like, well, I could actually, look 10 moves ahead and and then use like a heuristic to score 10 moves ahead. Like what I'm saying is, it's instructive to look at these toy mathematical examples to get a feel for what it's like to estimate probability of things. Okay, then you zoom out and you're like, all right, let's talk about the real world. What's going on in the real world? Well, the fact of the matter is you do kind of have these a priori belief probabilities, not about everything, but about lots of things. So for example, let's take rain, right? Like, Sean, what do you think is the probability that tomorrow it's going to rain here in Mountain View? Like 5%? Okay, sure. And my personal estimate is probably like, I don't know, 2%. And like the whole thing I'm basing it off is like I didn't really take a good look at like the clouds or anything like that. I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm basically basing it off how frequently I think it rains in general, as well as like the fact that we're like in between summer and fall, or like we're in fall. Okay, that's like the whole basis of my estimate. So I basically just asked myself the question of like, what is the frequency of rain here? And maybe I tried to use the fact, the context that I know roughly what season we're in. And I specifically didn't use any context of looking up at the sky earlier today because I'm not observant like that. Okay, so like that's how I did it. And if I were like a trained weatherman, I could probably like use other signals and like come up with a better probability distribution. But if you wanna get all precise about it, imagine this exercise. Imagine you have to give me an odds ratio, and then when you give me an odds ratio, let's say you give me 19 to 1 because you think there's a 5% chance. 19 to 1, it won't rain. And then I now choose at random that you have to either take the 1 side or the 19 side. So imagine that's the game we're playing. You give me an odds ratio, and after you do that, I force you to take either side of the odds ratio, like my choice. If that were the game we're playing, you would then be driven to make the odds ratio as accurate as you can. Because if you don't know which sides you have to take, the best thing you can do for yourself is to equally prefer both sides, because you think you've given an accurate estimate. So basically, if I basically like lock you up in a jail cell and force you to play that game in order to earn points, in order to buy your freedom, suddenly, real quick, you become very interested in rationally calibrated estimates of probabilities. Yeah, this is like a common rationalist thing to do, is to lock people up in jail cells. Yeah.
You mentioned this super intelligent AI would have the perfect map, right?
Yeah.
How is that perfect even defined or measured?
There's a formal way to define or measure it. It's called a Bayes score. So basically, not all rational minds are equally good at their job. So if I take like a brain scanner and look at everybody's belief probability distribution right now, the people who deserve the most Bayes score points are the people that are the most confident about their predictions, and their predictions are also accurate. So like to the degree that you actually don't know, you should assign a low confidence, but to the degree that you actually do know and are going to be right, you should assign a high confidence. I mean, it's actually kind of hard to talk about. I can send you a link. There's basically a precise way to calculate how many points your belief probability deserves as a function of how close to reality it is. It's called a Bayes score. Like, I'll give you an example, okay? Imagine Sean says it's 1 to 19, it won't rain, and imagine I say, you know what? I think it's a 50-50 that it might rain or might not rain. And then another guy says, I give it a 99% chance that it will rain. Okay, if it then rains, the guy who gave it a 99% chance that it'll rain is the winner, because the future outcome was given the most a priori probability by that guy. So that's kind of how Bayes score works. It's whoever gives the actual outcome the highest a priori probability wins the game. That's how Bayes score works. But the thing is, if it's like a series of 10 coin flips, imagine I'm going to flip a coin 10 times, or imagine I'm going to roll a 1,000-sided die. All right, pick a number. I'm going to pick a number between 1 and 1,000, and you guys all have to make a probability distribution over what number I'm about to pick. So you might think you're being really smart and be like, oh, 99% chance your number is going to be 327. 99% chance. Okay, well, if my number is like 401, you lose big, right? Because you probably gave like very, very little probability to me picking 401. So actually a good strategy might actually be to spread out your probabilities. So this is actually how it works with like every type of belief you can ever have. There's actually a formal mathematical system called Bayes score, which if I were building a super intelligent AI, not saying I am, then that's how I would program it. Yeah, Manoj.
Like in the foundation series, set of sci-fi books by authors like Isaac Asimov, these concepts where you have psychological influence of millions and millions of people across aliens or whatever across different galactic clusters. Do you think like the future of humankind is going to be more AI-ish? Do you think ego and other aspects are going to be more diminished in favor of something that's more rational and perhaps the ability to wire your mind to be like an everyday thing?
Okay, so I think I can break that down into two questions. Do I think the future is going to be very AI-ish, just like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series was? And do I think that in the potentially AI-ish future, there's going to be less ego and stuff? Right? Okay, cool. All right, first question. Do I think the future is going to be more AI-ish? Yes. I'll give you one example of why. Remember how I said that it's kind of lame that we only invented the scientific method 400 years ago? Well, the thing is we actually have another opportunity. Like the scientific method really isn't the end of the line here. Like the scientific method is actually pretty crude. We're actually at a time in our history where we're inventing the successor to the scientific method. It's actually the thing I just told you. It's Bayesian reasoning. Like Bayesian reasoning is flat out better. I mean, it's a refinement of the scientific method. Bayesian reasoning doesn't say don't use the scientific method. It's saying, you know that big part in your like 6th grade science textbook that says the scientific method says like do an experiment and then like do another experiment. You know how it like leaves a lot open to interpretation? Well, here's like a bunch of the details that it left open to interpretation. Like that's what Bayesian reasoning says. So it was like a 400-year gap between scientific method and Bayesian reasoning. Actually, probably less, because Bayesian reasoning was invented a few hundred years ago. Anyway, the fact that we're kind of seeing the successor to the scientific method today, and we kind of know the basic algorithms to program Bayesian reasoning into an AI, and it's a lot more well-defined than trying to program the scientific method into an AI. We're basically getting better at like the study of what should be going on inside your head. So like there's a big evolution there. So like well the other reason the future is going to be more AI-ish is just because like AIs just do a lot of stuff really well. I mean, like if I could put a chip in my brain that like made my mental math a lot faster, that'd be pretty great. Because it's kind of ridiculous how I have 1 trillion neurons and I have a hard time multiplying 2-digit by 2-digit numbers. It's like, you're kidding me? 1 trillion neurons? It's plenty of like RAM for that operation. Yeah. So yeah, the future is going to be AI-ish for sure. Oh, is there going to be less ego and stuff? I mean, look, the thing is I could program an AI to have like a huge ego, right? I could program an AI and have its hardware be the size of Jupiter and have 99% of the hardware dedicated to ego, right? So then it would have a huge ego, right? So I think that it's theoretically possible for that to happen, and a lot of it depends on initial conditions, meaning like the first AI that gets a lot of power because it's so smart and like control so many resources. Well, if somebody thought it was a cool joke to like program a big ego into it, well, now you have like an AI with a big ego like single-handedly controlling the universe. So the question you're asking is very sensitive to initial conditions. It's kind of like asking, it's like asking a question about like what direction do you think the air will be vibrating in this point of space 5 minutes after I detonate a huge nuke? That's kind of like the question you're asking. I would like a lot of people will answer your question by being like, oh well, you know, a lot of times air currents tend to move west, so I feel like west. It's like, dude, the answer to that question is very sensitive to initial conditions of detonating your nuke. Or like, what will be the shape of this little part of the nuclear blast? It's a very hard question to answer. That's why I would focus my energy on like, okay, who's going to be dropping this first nuke? Maybe they should hold off. Maybe we should like develop a really precise science of how nukes explode and go from there. And what I'm doing, I'm giving you an introduction to the field of AI risk, which has really become really popular, recently become very popular among smart people. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, we have like 2 minutes. Let's take one last question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of biological limitations. For example, basically the single biggest reason why we're all not smarter right now is actually because if women's hips were any larger, they'd have a hard time walking. Therefore, the human head is basically as big as it can be in order to fit through the birth canal. And it's actually pretty crazy because you see a lot of stories of babies, throughout history, a lot of women died in childbirth because evolution was so big on making us smarter, but it just couldn't because of the whole design of the waist. So your question was, are there biological limitations to becoming more intelligent? So yes, like the fact that we have cesarean sections now, like right off the bat, is probably shifting the natural selection dynamic toward smarter babies. So I think that's the answer you were looking for. All right, I think we'll end on that note. Okay. Hey, thanks everyone.